Hi, everybody. A few years ago, our network presbytery identified our core values, the principles by which we carry out our God-given mission. And so today we identify these as connection, collaboration, accountability, and empowerment. So let's talk about empowerment. We all value that, and it sounds nice, but how do we as a network do that in a practical way? And how do you cultivate that in your own ministry context or setting? Let me start by asking this. Have you ever felt disempowered? You ever felt that you were given a task but denied the resources to accomplish that task? Or maybe you were placed in a role but were given no authority to accomplish that mission? I still remember an incident that happened when I was younger in ministry, and I had just said something from the pulpit at the end of the worship time, and an authority figure who came up after me immediately shredded what I had just said. And I felt like my arms had been cut off. I was eviscerated. And from that incident alone, I determined that I wanted to be a pastor that empowers others to do what God calls them to do, even if they don't do it perfectly. So I want to quickly go over 5 ways to build a culture of empowerment. Number 1, regularly search for potential over flaws. So often we look at the areas that people aren't quite ready, they don't measure up, but I want to instead look who has potential. I'm always asking, God, who is on deck? Who is the next one to be up to bat in this particular role if someone left or got transitioned to a different location or a different ministry at some point? I have to remember that raw material is sometimes better than somebody that's fully ready. God uses the raw material of loaves and fishes, or a rough around the edges fisherman, or an unlikely younger brother who's watching the sheep out in the backyard. I'm always looking for who might be next. The next thing I do, number 2, is I provide little pulpits to develop people. I call them little pulpits because they're just creative ways to let people explore their gifts, to invite them to have a seat at the table, for their voice to be heard, their perspective to be valued, for them to provide input. Somebody might not be ready to lead an adult group, but maybe they could be a co-leader. Somebody might not be ready to preach a sermon, but I've had people before preach one point within my sermon. In the Nebraska network, we do this by the unofficial role of assistant presbytery. So we're constantly providing places for people to develop their gifts. Number 3, share some of the fruit that God has blessed you with. I know many years ago, the superintendent approached me and said, "Hey, I see Rick Lorimer as your youth pastor. Would it be okay if we approached him about becoming DYD?" And I got to tell you, I wasn't thrilled about the idea just because Rick is such a high quality leader, but I said, okay. And then sometime after that, the national office recognized Rick's gifts. And so the National Youth Department invited Rick to come from the position of Nebraska DYD down to Springfield. And so this time, though, I'd learned a little bit, and I said to the superintendent, "Have you considered Rod Whitlock?" He was on our staff at the time, and I sensed maybe it was time for a transition for Rod, and so Rod became a great DYD in the Nebraska district, and the national office wanted him to go serve there. And then the district contacted me again. They said, "We see a guy named Toby on your staff. Would you allow him to come and be the DYD in Nebraska?" And I thought, wow, I'm running out of fruit here, but I do recall that there's a principle. It's kind of like tithing. The more you give away, the more you have left. And it's kind of like what the church in Scotts Bluff does, allowing Leroy to not only be their pastor, but to have additional responsibilities as the district integrator for our Vision Nebraska. So I determine always to try to hold the people that God's blessed us with an open hand, and be willing to share some of the fruit that God's given you, because God will continue to provide more along the way. Number 4, call out the greatness that you see within someone. In other words, if you see somebody that has tremendous potential, or you see a real calling on somebody's life, don't be afraid to speak it forth. That's how you actually empower them to see themselves, that God wants to do something great within them. Many years ago, we were having an election for superintendent. Bob Wine was elected. It was the district council at that time that was in Bellevue. And after the election, I looked at Toby and I said, "Toby, you could be superintendent one day. And he just looked at me. And it was just, a couple of years ago when Toby was elected as our superintendent at that special January meeting here in Nebraska. Before the election, I went to Toby and I said, "Hey, Toby, do you remember that comment I made to you back then?" He said, "Yeah, I do." He said, "In fact, my wife just reminded me of that this very morning." And just a few hours later, Toby was elected as our new superintendent. There's only one other person I've ever said that to, and his name is Walter Hooker, and I believe he is such a high-quality leader that he could serve in a role like that perhaps someday as well. The last one, purposefully make room by sometimes stepping aside. Sometimes the only way that somebody can grow into the role that God has for them is if we who are leading in some areas are willing to take a step slightly to the side. It doesn't mean we quit or we bail, but maybe we just move out of the way a little bit so God can bring up the next level of leadership, perhaps the next generation of leaders as well. I've had the privilege of serving as assistant superintendent in this network now for almost 16 years. And I really sense that for me, it's time for me to do the very thing I'm suggesting to you. It's time for me to step to the side. So with that, I won't be allowing my name to be on the ballot for assistant superintendent this next go around. I believe God has somebody else that he's been grooming for such a time as this. I want to say thank you so much for letting me serve all these years, for allowing me to be a part of this fellowship. You've given me far more than I feel like I've ever given you. I love you all and believe God has great things in store for us. Let's be a culture that empowers